Welcome. Today we are turning our attention to the years 2000 through 2009. We're conducting an extensive exploration of the musical landscape of the 2000s, a decade that is often remembered for its chaotic energy and rapid evolution. When you look back at the start of the decade versus the end, well, the transformation is honestly staggering.
It is a highly significant period to analyze. Structurally speaking, it represents the vital bridge between the physical era of music consumption and the digital reality that you live in today.
It certainly is. This decade was a time of massive technological transition and genre fusion. We saw the technology of computers and internet sharing begin to really dissolve the traditional boundaries between styles. If you think about the 1990s, genres were fairly siloed. You had your rock stations, your hip-hop stations, your pop stations. But in the 2000s, rock, pop, metal, hip-hop, these distinct categories began to blur in ways we just had not seen previously.
If we examine the overarching structural changes of the decade, the primary mission of our analysis today is to understand the fragmentation of the monoculture. To be precise, when we use the term monoculture, we are referring to a shared mainstream experience where a vast majority of the population consumes the exact same media and listens to the same few artists.
Right.
The internet and globalization effectively dismantled this. The technology allowed for niche explosions. We observed the rise of highly specific movements like new disco and the post-punk revival. However, despite this vast fragmentation, specific genres, particularly contemporary R&B and hip-hop, managed to achieve and maintain absolute dominance.
That concept of the monoculture fracturing, that is key to understanding everything we are going to discuss. But before that fracture was entirely complete, there was one genre that absolutely ruled the airwaves. Let us begin our analysis with the sheer commercial dominance of North American hip-hop.
It is the most logical starting point given the sales data. The early 2000s marked the precise moment where hip-hop transitioned from being a major genre to the undisputed dominant genre of global popular culture.
Hip-hop dominated popular music in the early 2000s to an extent that is almost hard to overstate.
Yeah.
The list of commercial juggernauts from this era is extensive. We're talking about massive artists like Eminem, Outkast, Jay-Z, Kanye West, and 50 Cent. These were not just successful rappers. They were the major players who defined the sound of the charts globally.
Correct.
50 Cent's debut, for example, that was an event that transcended music entirely. It was a complete multimedia takeover.
And their influence extended far beyond just the audio genre charts. These artists were actively setting the global fashion trends, formulating the slang, and defining the lifestyle aspirations for an entire generation of consumers.
Yeah, exactly. And within that dominance, Eminem specifically stands out as a statistical anomaly. He was the decade's top-selling artist across all genres, not just in rap, but selling more than the biggest pop stars or the biggest rock bands of the entire era. According to the data we have, 2 of Eminem's albums were among the top 5 highest-selling albums of the entire 2000s. And then with the release of his album Relapse, he officially secured his position as the best-selling rapper of all time.
Eminem's specific role requires careful analysis. He was a white rapper who achieved massive commercial success in a predominantly black art form. He maintained his relevance throughout the decade by actively employing controversy and subversion.
Right, his lyrics were everywhere.
If you analyze his lyrical content and his public persona, he was constantly pushing against the boundaries of what was deemed acceptable by mainstream media. This calculated approach allowed him to bridge various demographics that other artists in the genre had not reached. He specifically connected with a white, suburban working-class audience while simultaneously maintaining credibility within the core hip-hop community.
And while Eminem was dominating globally from Detroit, there was a really significant geographical shift occurring within the United States. For a long time, hip-hop was defined by the East Coast versus West Coast rivalry, mostly New York and Los Angeles. But in the 2000s, we saw a massive move away from that traditional axis. The rise of the Dirty South became a defining characteristic of the decade.
This regional shift brought entirely new subgenres to the forefront of the industry. The standard tempo slowed down, the bass frequencies got much heavier, and the production style became distinctly different from the traditional sample-heavy sound of New York.
Exactly. Crunk is a prime example of this southern explosion. You have Lil Jon and the East Side Boys really paving the way for this sound around 2003. It was incredible high energy, club-oriented music. It wasn't about complex lyricism. It was all about the chant, the energy, and the physical reaction you would get in a club setting. And following Crunk, we saw the emergence of snap music, which fueled this massive dance craze era from approximately 2005 to 2009.
The commercialization of specific dance moves was a vital component of this era's marketing strategy. It essentially predated the viral trends you see on social media platforms today, but the underlying mechanism of audience replication was exactly the same.
The artists driving this included Dem Franchise Boys, D4L, and of course, Soulja Boy. Soulja Boy's Crank, Soon Firth. That in 2007 was just a massive phenomenon. It was widely considered the biggest dance fad since the Macarena. You could not turn on a video channel or go to a school dance without seeing everyone doing that specific choreography.
Indeed.
And Soulja Boy was also one of the first artists to really utilize the internet to distribute his music and his instructional dance videos directly to fans, completely bypassing the traditional industry gatekeepers.
This specific era marked a fundamental shift toward interactive music consumption. The audience participation via the dance was as important to the product's success as the audio track itself. The song served as a set of physical instructions rather than just a traditional audio narrative.
Meanwhile, over on the West Coast, specifically in Northern California and the Bay Area, we saw the hyphy movement. This culture was intense and highly regional. It involved specific slang like yada Brazilian, the use of ecstasy, and a really unique practice known as ghostwriting, where a driver would literally put the car in neutral and dance outside of it while it was still moving.
It is important to note the industry backlash to these movements. Hip-hop purists and pioneer artists viewed these highly commercial trends negatively. They felt the lyrical complexity and the social messaging of the genre were being rapidly eroded by repetitive hooks and dance gimmicks.
Yeah, there was a lot of pushback.
Ice-T denounced the crunk and snap era quite publicly. Furthermore, Nas released an album and a song in 2006 titled Hip Hop is Dead. This signaled a clear ideological divide between the traditionalists and the new wave of commercial party rap.
And technology also began to directly impact the actual sound of the recordings. In the mid to late 2000s, we saw the rise of ringtone rap. These were songs specifically constructed with repetitive hooks to be sold as ringtones. You have to remember, this was well before streaming. People were paying $2 or $3 just to have a low-quality snippet of a song play when their phone rang.
The medium of consumption began to explicitly dictate the structure of the musical composition. Because the audio is coming out of very small, low-fidelity phone speakers, the music needed to be structurally simple, highly treble-heavy, and incredibly catchy within the first few seconds. It effectively simplified the songwriting process to maximize sales in that specific digital format.
Simultaneously, the auto-tune revolution began. It started as the Cher effect back in 1998, but by the mid-2000s, T-Pain had popularized it as a deliberate stylistic choice. He wasn't using it to fix bad notes, he was using it to sound robotic and futuristic. And the Black Eyed Peas utilized auto-tune and this electropop fusion on their album, The E&D, to score massive hits like Boom Boom Pow.
This is a crucial technological development. Auto-tune transitioned from being a covert studio tool used for subtle pitch correction simply to hide vocal mistakes to a highly visible, stylistic instrument. It permeated R&B, pop, and electronic dance music, fundamentally altering the vocal texture of the entire decade. It created a sound that was distinctly artificial, which aligned perfectly with the increasing digitalization of society.
Moving on to the rock genre, we witnessed a really significant fragmentation. While hip-hop was dominating the overall charts, rock was actively splitting into various sub-tribes. Let us look at pop-punk and emo.
This period was effectively a second wave for pop-punk, following its initial mainstream explosion in the 1990s.
In the early 2000s, we had the sheer dominance of Blink-182 with massive hits like Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. We also saw a huge success from Sum 41 and Good Charlotte. These bands brilliantly captured the suburban teenage experience, the boredom, the rebellion, and the relationship drama.
That is correct.
Then, as we moved into the mid to late 2000s, Fall Out Boy rose to prominence with these very intricate lyrics and heavy pop hooks. At the same time, Green Day released American Idiot in 2004 and 21st Central Breakdown in 2009. These albums represented a much more mature, politically charged sound for the genre, specifically criticizing the political climate of the United States at that time.
American Idiot served to completely revitalize Green Day's career at a point where their commercial popularity had begun to wane. It proved to the industry that a pop-punk band could successfully write a cohesive rock opera, tackle serious socio-political themes, and still achieve massive global commercial success.
Then there was the explosion of emo. Jimmy Eat World's Bleed American was totally instrumental in breaking this sound into the mainstream, moving it from the underground hardcore scene straight to pop radio. We saw a huge aesthetic expansion associated with bands like My Chemical Romance, Panic, At the Disco, and Paramore. This involved very specific fashion choices, tight jeans, dyed black hair with long side bangs, and heavy eyeliner that became entirely synonymous with the genre.
There was considerable sociological friction regarding the terminology here. Many bands that were labeled emo by the music press and the general public actively rejected the term. They viewed it as creatively limiting or even derogatory.
Right, nobody wanted to be called an emo band.
Despite this vocal rejection, they achieved massive commercial success among the adolescent demographic. The music provided a highly effective emotional outlet for teenagers who felt alienated by the polished pop and the aggressive hip-hop of the era.
Alongside pop-punk, we had nu metal and post-grunge. Nu metal acted as a major bridge from the late 90s, combining heavy metal guitar riffs with hip-hop rhythms and rapping. Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory was just a juggernaut, selling 24 million copies worldwide. Their blend of electronic elements, rap, and screaming vocals perfectly encapsulated the genre-blending spirit of the decade. Limp Bizkit also dominated during this time with Chocolate Starfish.
However, nu metal experienced a remarkably rapid commercial decline around 2005. The market became heavily oversaturated, and the stylistic novelty simply wore off. This economic reality forced many bands within that scene to quickly pivot toward alternative rock or more traditional heavy metal in order to survive.
In stark contrast to that, post-grunge demonstrated incredible commercial stamina. Nickelback sold 50 million albums, becoming one of the most successful acts of the decade. Bands like Creed and Daughtry also maintained massive sales figures throughout the decade. This music was highly radio-friendly, melodic, and fit perfectly on rock radio formats across the country.
While critical reception varied wildly, and these bands were often the subject of intense ridicule by music critics, the commercial data for post-grunge indicates a very loyal and exceptionally large listener base. It perfectly highlights a common disconnect between elite critical acclaim and mass popular consumption.
Another significant rock trend was the garage rock or post-punk revival. This was often characterized by the bands craze. We were talking about the Strokes with, is this it? The White Stripes with White Blood Cells, the Hives, and the Vines.
This movement operated as a direct auditory reaction to the dominant production style of the time. While nu metal was heavily down-tuned and aggressive and pop was pristine and purely digital, this revival deliberately sought to look backward for its inspiration.
The aesthetic was totally stripped back and retro-inspired. It was heavily influenced by the Velvet Underground and 70s rock. The White Stripes, for instance, famously used only a guitar and drums, completely rejecting the bass guitar entirely to create this incredibly raw, urgent sound. Later on, bands like The Killers with Hot Fuss and Franz Ferdinand brought this sound to the global charts, adding a bit more of a danceable rhythm to the mix.
This was a deliberate return to authentic rock instrumentation. It served as a necessary counter-narrative to the overproduced sounds of nu metal and the polished pop production that was dominating the airwaves. It appealed directly to listeners who wanted rock music to sound like it was actually being played by human beings in a physical room, rather than constructed sequentially on a computer screen.
Speaking of polished production, let us turn to Section 3, Pop, R&B, and the Rise of the Solo Superstar. This is where we really see the machinery of the music industry operating at full capacity.
This section is particularly interesting because it highlights the transition of teen idols into viable adult careers, which is a notoriously difficult and historically precarious maneuver in the entertainment industry.
The decade began with the absolute reign of Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. They had exploded onto the scene in the late 90s as the princesses of teen pop. However, there was a very distinct shift from bubblegum pop to an adult or urban sound in the early 2000s. We saw this with Britney's 2001 self-titled album and Christina's Stripped in 2002. These albums were much more provocative, the lyrics were more suggestive, and the production leaned heavily into R&B and hip-hop textures.
This transition was a mathematical necessity for their longevity. If they had continued to manufacture music strictly for 12-year-olds, their careers would have predictably stalled as their original audience aged out. By aggressively pivoting to a more mature image and sound, they successfully brought their enormous fan base along with them into adulthood.
The boy band phenomenon also evolved dramatically. NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys began to fade or change direction as the bubblegum pop era naturally waned. This paved the way for Justin Timberlake's massive breakout. After leaving NSYNC, he released Justified in 2002 and Future Sex Love Sounds in 2006. Those albums completely established him as a solo R&B and pop giant. He worked very closely with producers like the Neptunes and Timbaland to create a sound that was sleek, funky, and universally critically acclaimed.
Timberlake successfully navigated the structural transition from a group member to an individual solo artist, which is, again, historically quite difficult to execute. He managed to distance himself just enough from his highly commercialized boy band past to be taken seriously by adult listeners and established critics.
In the realm of R&B, we saw the total dominance of the queens. Beyoncé first dominated with Destiny's Child, which became the best-selling female R&B group of all time. But her solo career is where she truly became a global icon. With albums like I Am Sasha Fierce, she introduced the world to her alter ego and delivered massive cultural hits like Single Ladies.
Her career trajectory represents a steady, highly calculated climb to cultural ubiquity. She managed to perfectly balance broad commercial pop appeal with genuine vocal virtuosity and a commanding stage presence that essentially set the new standard for live performance.
Mariah Carey experienced a bit of a lull early in the decade. She had some commercial stumbles and personal struggles that played out very publicly in the media. But she staged this massive comeback with the emancipation of Mimi in 2005. The song We Belong Together was actually named the Song of the Decade by Billboard.
That is correct. The metrics on that single were extraordinary.
It was a massive return to form. Alicia Keys and Mary J. Blige also completely dominated the charts, blending soul with heavy hip-hop influences. Alicia Keys in particular brought a classical piano element to mainstream R&B that really set her apart from her peers.
A vital factor to analyze here was the aggressive cross-pollination of genres. It became the absolute standard formula for hits to have pop stars intentionally collaborate with rappers and urban producers, such as Timbaland. This strategically merged the vast fan bases of both pop and hip-hop. You couldn't just have a standard pop song. You fundamentally needed a guest verse from a rapper to secure play on urban radio, and rappers reciprocally needed pop hooks to secure play on top 40 radio.
While the adults were heavily listening to R&B, the Disney machine was just ramping up to full speed. Children's music saw a huge, significant rise in sales. We had absolute juggernaut franchises like High School Musical, The Cheetah Girls, and Hannah Montana. This wasn't just music. It was a total corporate synergy of television movies, soundtracks, and massive arena concert tours.
This infrastructure created a highly efficient, self-contained ecosystem for launching new talent. The Disney Corporation could debut a song on their proprietary Disney Channel, instantly promote the physical soundtrack in their retail stores, and simultaneously sell premium tickets to the live tour. It effectively bypassed the traditional radio promotion hierarchy entirely.
And this machine launched the massive careers of Miley Cyrus, the Jonas Brothers, and Demi Lovato. Miley Cyrus, as Hannah Montana, was essentially living a double life on screen, but in reality she was selling out actual arenas as both characters on the same night.
It capitalized on the tween demographic in a highly systematic way that had not been fully exploited previously. The industry data finally recognized that this specific age group possessed significant independent purchasing power and demanded music that spoke directly to their specific adolescent experiences.
Toward the end of the decade, we saw a massive resurgence of electronic pop. Lady Gaga arrived with the fame in 2008. Singles like Just Dance and Poker Face totally revived dance pop on the mainstream charts. Before Gaga, dance music had largely been relegated to underground clubs, or just to Europe. She brought that heavy, four-on-the-floor beat right back to American pop radio.
This shift connects directly back to the broader influence of Eurodance and the eventual reintegration of synthpop into the American mainstream consciousness. It signaled a definitive shift away from the mid-tempo R&B dominance of the early 2000s and directly paved the way for the massive EDM boom that would inevitably follow in the subsequent decade.
Now, let us examine country music, which faced a really interesting identity crisis while simultaneously experiencing a massive commercial boom. The narrative of country music in the 2000s is fascinating because it ran entirely counter to the general industry trend of rapidly declining music sales.
The commercial resilience of country music during this specific period is highly notable. While the rest of the music industry was struggling immensely with internet piracy and the painful transition to digital formats, country fans remained remarkably loyal to purchasing physical albums.
So while mainstream sales dipped, country music sales actually rose. The American Idol effect was substantial here. Carrie Underwood became the first winner to record primarily country music, and she went on to score 8 #1 hits. Her voice was just incredibly powerful, and her victory on literally the biggest TV show in America brought a massive influx of brand new listeners to the genre.
Reality television essentially provided a highly efficient new pipeline for country stardom, completely bypassing the grueling traditional Nashville route of playing in small honky-tonks for years. It exponentially accelerated the complex process of discovering and marketing new talent.
Then there was the Taylor Swift phenomenon. She debuted in the late 2000s as a teenager. Her album Fearless spawned massive global hits like Love Story and You Belong With Me. She was writing these songs about high school romance that somehow resonated universally.
Her impact on the industry was deeply structural. Before Taylor Swift, country music was largely perceived by the industry as music exclusively for adults.
Right. She achieved crossover success on the Hot 100 while also topping the country charts. Fearless topped the Billboard 200 for 11 weeks. That is a very rare feat for a country artist.
Swift fundamentally changed the economic landscape by proving that young female singer-songwriters could single-handedly drive massive multi-platinum sales. This hard data aggressively encouraged record labels to sign much younger talent, permanently shifting the demographic focus of the genre toward a younger, heavily female audience.
But this shift did not come without controversy. There was a very significant pop versus traditional debate raging. The music mafia, which included acts like Big and Rich and Gretchen Wilson, heavily promoted a style they called hip-hop and rock fusion. They were literally rapping over fiddles and bringing this chaotic rock and roll energy to country radio.
The traditionalists within the industry were highly vocal in their opposition. They felt the genre was rapidly losing its historical roots in acoustic instrumentation and authentic storytelling.
George Jones, an absolute legend of the genre, even went on record in 2009 claiming that these new artists essentially stole their identity and were just repackaged pop artists. Songs like Murder on Music Row explicitly criticized this pop sound, openly lamenting the death of the traditional country sound.
This ongoing tension between commercial viability and traditional authenticity is a recurring theme throughout the entire history of country music. But the data shows it was particularly acute in the 2000s as the genre drastically expanded its global reach.
Let us expand our view to global sounds now, starting with Europe and Latin America. The 2000s were not just about American exports. The rest of the world was talking back louder than ever.
The rapid globalization of music consumption is incredibly evident here. The proliferation of the internet allowed distinct regional sounds to travel across international borders faster than at any previous point in history.
In the United Kingdom, we entered the post-Britpop era. The brashness of bands like Oasis and Blur kind of faded, giving way to a much more melodic, introspective sound. Coldplay achieved huge U.S. number ones, notably with Viva La Vida. They essentially became one of the biggest bands in the entire world. We also saw the massive rise of British female soul. Amy Winehouse won 5 Grammys in 2008 with her album Back to Black. Her sound was heavily retro, drawing from 60s girl groups and jazz, but her attitude was thoroughly modern and raw. We also saw Duffy, Adele, and Corinne Bailey Rae emerging in this exact same wave.
Winehouse's critical and commercial success effectively forced open the door for soulful British female vocalists in the highly competitive American market. Without the precedent set by Amy Winehouse, it is highly unlikely the industry would have seen the massive, record-breaking success of Adele later on.
Electronic music also continued to evolve over there, with trance DJs like Tiesto and Armin van Buuren literally filling entire stadiums, and French house legends like Daft Punk heavily influencing pop production globally.
The European electronic scene maintained a very steady underlying influence on global production trends. Key structural elements of trance and house music began to subtly seep into standard American pop and hip-hop production.
We also had these really notable one-hit wonders and early viral hits, such as Ozone's Dragostea Din Tai, which most of you probably know as the Numa Numa song. This song became a massive internet phenomenon strictly due to a viral video of a man lip-syncing to it at his desk. It perfectly showed the power of the early internet to create massive hits out of completely obscure foreign language tracks. The Cheeky Girls also represented the novelty pop aspect of the European charts during this time.
That phenomenon highlights the very beginning of user-generated content directly dictating global music consumption trends.
Moving over to Latin America, the reggaeton explosion was absolutely the defining story. Daddy Yankee's Gasolina in 2004 introduced the genre globally. It combined Jamaican dancehall rhythms with Latin hip-hop and a very specific driving beat known as the dembow.
This was a genuine watershed moment for Latin urban music. It took a localized sound that was historically marginalized and kept underground in Puerto Rico and engineered it into a ubiquitous global club anthem.
And Shakira achieved massive crossover success. Whenever Wherever in 2001 and Hips Don't Lie in 2006 established her as the best-selling Latin female artist. She seamlessly blended rock, pop, and Middle Eastern influences with her traditional Latin roots.
Precisely.
We also saw the dominance of Mexican pop with artists like Paulina Rubio and a massive boom in regional Mexican narco-corrido music. This genre, which often tells very gritty stories of the drug trade, saw sales over $2 million per year, despite heavy government censorship attempts.
Sociologically, the rise of reggaeton is highly significant because it effectively replaced traditional salsa and merengue as a primary dance music for the youth demographic in Latin America. It explicitly signaled a generational shift in cultural expression, moving heavily toward a sound that was far more urban and aggressive.
Finally, we look to the Asian market and other international scenes. This decade really laid the groundwork for the massive global explosion of Asian pop culture we see today.
The Western structural influence in these markets is palpable, but the highly specific local adaptation is what truly drives the immense commercial success. They essentially took the foundational formula of Western boy bands and girl groups and heavily refined it with incredibly intense training regimens and pristine production values.
In Japan, Ayumi Hamasaki was known as the Empress of Japanese pop. She constantly reinvented her image and wrote her own lyrics, resonating deeply with young women across the country. Hikaru Utada also saw just massive success. Her album Distance sold over 3 million copies in a single week. Johnny's boy bands, such as Arashi, remained incredibly popular, completely dominating the music charts and television variety shows.
The idol culture in Japan remained a totally dominant economic force. It is a highly integrated multimedia industry where the musical idols are contractually expected to be actors, television hosts, and fashion models, as well as standard singers.
In South Korea, we saw the Hallyu Wave, or the Korean Wave. There was a major resurgence of idol groups after a bit of a slump in the late 90s. TVXQ and BoA really led the way, breaking into the highly lucrative Japanese market and setting the stage for total global expansion. They were then followed by the second-generation groups like Big Bang, Girls' Generation, and Super Junior.
It is critically important to note the intentional integration of Western production styles here. R&B and hip-hop textures were heavily integrated into J-pop and K-pop production throughout this decade. However, the flawless visual presentation and the highly intricate group choreography became the entirely distinct hallmarks of the K-pop product.
In the world of Mandopop, Jay Chou established a completely new style by blending Mandarin pop with R&B and hip-hop. His debut album, Jay, in 2000, really set the tone. He rapped in a way that was often mumbled, which was highly controversial at the time, but eventually became his absolute signature style. We also saw the huge success of F4 with Meteor Rain, which sparked a massive boy band craze across Asia, and the girl group SHE with their album Superstar.
The data shows a continuous, highly lucrative loop of cultural exchange in these regions.
In India, indie pop was on the rise, competing directly with traditional Bollywood film music. But the biggest story was probably A.R. Rahman, who achieved immense global fame, really highlighted by his incredible work on the soundtrack for Slumdog Millionaire, which won him 2 Academy Awards.
There was also a significant reverse influence occurring simultaneously. Western hip-hop artists like Timbaland, Britney Spears, and the Black Eyed Peas actively began sampling Bollywood sounds. The highly distinctive strings and complex percussion of Indian music brought a completely fresh auditory texture to standard Western pop.
In the Middle East and Africa, we saw the early origins of Afrobeats in West Africa. P-Square and Two-Faced Idibia brilliantly blended American hip-hop with local high-life rhythms. This fusion created a sound that was uniquely African, but with massive international appeal.
Yes, the rhythmic structures were highly adaptable.
Arabic pop stars like Nancy Ajram and Amr Diab absolutely dominated their region. Nancy Ajram became a massive icon with hits like Akasmak. There was also a lot of controversy surrounding female sexuality in these music videos, particularly with Haifa Weeby, whose imagery directly challenged conservative cultural norms.
It was a period of pushing boundaries.
And specific local scenes also grew, such as the hip-hop movement in Botswana with artists like Scar and Cast, as well as flourishing scenes in Senegal and Ivory Coast. This showed that rap was being actively used as a very powerful tool for local storytelling.
This definitively demonstrates that hip-hop had truly become a universal global language by the end of the decade. It was no longer just a standard American export. It was being continually adapted to fit specific local contexts, diverse languages, and unique political struggles.
As we look back at the entire decade, the legacy is incredibly clear. The music industry completely fragmented. We shifted from buying physical CDs to purchasing digital downloads via iTunes, and we dealt heavily with the massive rise of digital piracy through platforms like Napster and LimeWire. The traditional album format really began to lose its iron grip as listeners realized they could just pick and choose single tracks.
The ultimate sociological result of this technological shift was the total loss of the monoculture. By the end of the 2000s, there was no longer one single prescribed way to be a rock star or a pop star. The internet had successfully created infinite, sustainable niches. You could be incredibly famous to a million dedicated people on the internet and remain completely unknown to the rest of the physical world. The shared, unified experience of the top 40 was beginning to rapidly erode.
It has been a truly informative review. We have covered the major genre trends, the seismic technological shifts, and the massive global expansion of the music scene from 2000 to 2009, from the sheer dominance of hip-hop and the fragmentation of rock, all the way to the rise of the solo superstar and the total explosion of global sounds. I think a great final thought for you to explore on your own is how the intense piracy of this era actually forced artists to become better live performers, since touring became their only real source of income.
The historical data firmly supports the conclusion that this was a deeply transformative era. It definitively set the economic and structural rules for the digital music industry that we actively operate within today.
We hope this comprehensive analysis has provided a really clear, detailed picture of the 2000s in music. It was a decade of incredible noise, vibrant color, and massive, unstoppable change.
The relentless integration of new technology and the continually shifting geographical centers of cultural influence were undeniably the defining characteristics of this period.
Thanks for listening.